All right. I think that'll about do it. All right. Welcome back to Storytime Saturdays. I am your narrator for today, Fraggoth. Excuse me. And there is some sort of heavy particulate matter in the air, so I've got a sore throat. So I'm gonna make this work. So continuing today, we are continuing with our reading of, well, my reading of Blindsight. Um, Technically my rereading, but none of you have heard me read it before. So there. Let's see. Where did we leave off? All right. So Rorschach, the alien artifact, object, satellite, vessel orbiting Big Ben, this sub-brown dwarf that's floating around outside the out in the Kuiper Belt, has been communicating with the folks on Theseus. And the last thing that was said, here we go. I'll just read this last little bit. And suddenly Rorschach snapped into view. No refractory composites, no profiles or simulations in false color. There it was at last, naked even to human eyes. Imagine a crown of thorns, twisted, dark, and unreflective, grown too thickly tangled to ever rest on any human head. Put it in orbit around a failed star whose own reflected half-light does little more than throw its satellites into silhouette. Occasional bloody highlights glinted like dim embers from its twists and crannies. They only emphasized the darkness everywhere else. Imagine an artifact that embodies the very notion of torture, something so wrenched and disfigured that even across uncounted light years and unimaginable differences in biology and outlook, you can't help but feel that somehow the structure itself is in pain. Now make it the size of a city. It flickered as we watched. Lightning arced from recurved spines 1,000 meters long. Consensus showed us a strobe-lit hellscape, huge and dark and twisted. The composites had lied. It was not the least bit beautiful. Now it's too late, something said from deep inside. Now every last one of you is dead. And Susan? You there, Susan? We're taking you first. So just now we're caught up. That was the big reveal um, so far. I had to kind of half-ass that because, again, excuse me, one sec. Sorry about that. Because my throat's a little sore and cough-like. So, we're just going to read from there. I also have a friggin' cough drop in my mouth, which isn't going to make doing voices any easier. But it's helping. Quite a bit, substantial improvement. So, continuing on. Life's too short for chess. Lord Byron. They never sealed the hatch behind them. It was too easy to get lost up there in the dome, naked, infinite space, stretching 180 degrees on every axis. They needed all that emptiness, but they needed an anchor in its midst. Soft, stray light from astern, a gentle draft from the drum, the sounds of people and machinery close by. They needed to have it both ways. I lay in wait. Reading a dozen blatant cues in their behavior, I was already squirreled away in the forward airlock when they passed. I gave them a few minutes and crept forward to the darkened bridge. Of course they called her by name, Spindle was saying. That was the only name they had. She told them, remember? Yes. Michelle didn't seem reassured. Hey, it was you guys said we were talking to a Chinese room. You saying you were wrong? We... No, of course not. Then it wasn't really threatening Suze at all, was it? It wasn't threatening any of us. It had no idea what it was saying. It's rule-based, Isaac. It was following some kind of flow chart it drew up by observing human languages in action, and somehow those rules told it to respond with threats of violence. But if it doesn't even know what it was saying... It doesn't. It can't. We parsed the phrasing 19 different ways, tried out conceptual units of every different length. A long, deep breath. But it attacked the probe, Isaac. Jack just got it too close to one of those electrode thingies is all. It just arced. So you don't think Rorschach is hostile? Long silence. Long enough to make me wonder if I'd been detected. Hostile, Spindle said at last. Friendly. We learned those words for life on Earth, eh? I don't know if they even apply out here. His lips smacked faintly. But I think it might be something like hostile. Michelle sighed. Isaac, there's no reason for... I mean, it just doesn't make sense that it would be. We can't have anything it wants. It says it wants to be left alone, Spindle said, even if it doesn't mean it. They floated quietly for a while, up there past the bulkhead. At least the shielding held, Spindle said finally. That's something. He wasn't just talking about Jack. Our own carapace was coated with the same stuff now. It had depleted our substrate stockpiles by 2/3, but no one wanted to rely on the ship's usual magnetics in the face of anything that could play so easily with the electromagnetic spectrum. If they attack, what do we do? Michelle said. Learn what we can while we can. Fight back while we can. If we can. Look out there, Isaac. I don't care how embryonic that thing is. Tell me we're not hopelessly outmatched. Outmatched, for sure. Hopelessly? Never. That's not what you said before. Still, there's always a way to win. If I said that, you'd call it wishful thinking. If you said that, it would be. But I'm saying it, so it's game theory. Game theory again. Jesus, Isaac. No, listen, you're thinking about the aliens like they were some kind of mammal, something that cares, something that looks after its investments. How do you know they aren't? Because you can't protect your kids when they're light years away. They're on their own, and it's a big, cold, dangerous universe, so most of them aren't going to make it, eh? The most you can do is crank out millions of kids. Take cold comfort in knowing that a few always luck out through random chance. It's not a mammal mindset, Mish. You want an earthbound simile, think of dandelion seeds. Or herring. A soft sigh. So they're interstellar herring. That hardly means they can't crush us. But they don't know about us, not in advance. Dandelion seed doesn't know what it's up against before it sprouts. Maybe nothing. Maybe some spastic weed that goes over like straw in the wind. Or maybe something that kicks its ass halfway to the Magellanic Clouds. It doesn't know, and there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all survival strategy. Something that aces against one player blows goats against a different one. So the best you can do is mix up your strategies based on the odds. It's a weighted dice roll, and it gives you the best mean payoff over the whole game. But you're bound to crap out and choose the wrong strategy at least some of the time. Price of doing business. And that means that weak players not only can win against stronger ones, but they're statistically bound to in some cases. Michelle snorted. That's your game theory? Rock, paper, scissors with statistics? Maybe Spindle didn't know the reference. He didn't speak, long enough to call up a subtitle. Then he brayed like a horse. Rock, paper, scissors! Yes! Michelle digested that for a moment. You're sweet for trying, but that only works if the other side is just blindly playing the odds. And they don't have to do that if they know who they're going up against in advance. And, my dear, they have so very much information about us. They'd threatened Susan. by name. They don't know everything, Spindle insisted. And the principle works for any scenario involving incomplete information, not just the ignorant extreme. Not as well. But some, and that gives us a chance. Doesn't matter how good you are at poker when it comes to the deal, eh? Cards still deal out with the same odds. So that's what we're playing. Poker. Be thankful it's not chess. We wouldn't have a hope in hell. Hey, I'm supposed to be the optimist in this relationship. You are. I'm just fatalistically cheerful. We all come into the story halfway through. We all catch up as best we can, and we're all gonna die before it ends. That's my Isaac, master of the no-win scenario. You can win. Winner's the guy who makes the best guess on how it all comes out. So you are just guessing. Yup. And you can't make an informed guess without data, eh? And we could be the very first to find out what's gonna happen to the whole human race. I'd say that puts us into the semifinals easy. Michelle didn't answer for a long time. When she did, I couldn't hear her words. Neither could Spindle. Sorry? Covert to invulnerable, you said. Remember? Uh-huh. Rorschach's graduation day. How soon do you think? No idea. But I don't think it's the kind of thing that's gonna slip by unnoticed. And that's why I don't think it attacked us. She must have looked a question. Because when it does, it won't be some debatable candy-ass bitch slap, he told her. When that fucker rises up, we're gonna know. A sudden flicker from behind. I spun in the cramped passageway and bit down on a cry. Something squirmed out of sight around the corner. Something with arms barely glimpsed, gone in an instant. Never there. Couldn't be there. Impossible. Did you hear that? Spindle asked, but I'd fled to stern before Michelle could answer him. We'd fallen so far that the naked eye didn't see a disk, barely even saw curvature anymore. We were falling towards a wall, a vast, roiling expanse of dark thunderclouds that extended in all directions to some new, infinitely distant horizon. Ben filled half the universe, and still we fell. Far below, Jack clung to Rorschach's ridged surface with bristly gecko feet fenders and set up camp. It sent X-rays and ultrasound into the ground, tapped inquiring fingers and listened to the echoes, planted tiny explosive charges and measured the resonance of their detonations. It shed seeds like pollen, tiny probes and sensors by the thousands, self-powered, nearsighted, stupid, and expendable. The vast majority were sacrificial offerings to random chance. Only 1 in 100 lasted long enough to return usable telemetry. While our advanced scout took measure of its local neighborhood, Theseus drew larger-scale bird's-eye maps from the closing sky. It spat out thousands of its own disposable probes, spread them across the heavens, and collected stereoscopic data from 1,000 simultaneous perspectives. Patchwork insights assembled in the drum. Rorschach's skin was 60% superconducting carbon nanotube. Rorschach's guts were largely hollow. At least some of those hollows appeared to contain an atmosphere. No earthly form of life would have lasted a second in there, though. Intricate topographies of radiation and electromagnetic force seethed around the structure, seethed within it. In some places, the radiation was intense enough to turn unshielded flesh to ash in an instant. Calmer backwaters would merely kill in the same span of time. Charged particles raced around invisible racetracks at relativistic speeds, erupting from jagged openings, hugging curves of magnetic force strong enough for neutron stars, arcing through open space and plunging back into black mass. Occasional protuberances swelled and burst and released clouds of microparticulates, seeding the radiation belts like spores. Rorschach resembled nothing so much as a nest of half-naked cyclotrons, tangled one with another. Neither Jack below nor Theseus above could find any points of entry beyond those impassable gaps that spat out streams of charged particles or swallowed them back down. No airlocks or hatches or viewports resolved with increasing proximity. The fact that we'd been threatened via laser beam implied some kind of optical antennae or typecast array. We weren't even able to find that much. A central hallmark of von Neumann machines was self-replication. Whether Rorschach would meet that criterion, whether it would germinate or divide or give birth when it passed some critical threshold, whether it had done so already, remained an open question. One of 1,000. At the end of it all, after all the measurements, the theorizing and deduction and outright guesswork, we settled into orbit with 1,000,000 trivial details and no answers. In terms of the big questions, there was only one thing we knew for sure. So far, Rorschach was holding its fire. It sounded to me like it knew what it was saying, I remarked. I guess that's the whole point, Bates said. She had no one to confide in, partook of no intimate dialogues that could be overheard. With her, I used the direct approach. Theseus was birthing a litter, 2 by 2. They were nasty-looking things, armored, squashed egg shapes, twice the size of a human torso and studded with gardening implements, antennae, optical ports, retractable thread saws, weapons muzzles. Bates was summoning her troops. We floated before the primary fab port at the base of Theseus's spine. The plant could just as easily have disgorged the grunts directly into the hold beneath the carapace. That was where they'd be stored anyway, until called upon. But Bates was giving each a visual inspection before sending it through one of the airlocks a few meters up the passageway. Ritual, perhaps. Military tradition. Certainly, there was nothing she could see with her eyes that wouldn't be glaringly obvious to the most basic diagnostic. Would it be a problem? I asked. Running them without your interface? Run themselves just fine. Response time actually improves without spam in the network. I'm more of a safety precaution. Theseus growled, giving us more attitude. The plating trembled to stern, another piece of local debris, no longer in our path. We were angling toward an equatorial orbit just a few minuscule kilometers above the artifact. Insanely, the approach curved right through the accretion belt. It didn't bother the others. Like surviving traffic in a high-speed lane, Sasha had said, disdainful of my misgivings. Try creeping across and you're roadkill. Gotta speed up, go with the flow. But the flow was turbulent. We hadn't gone 5 minutes without a course correction since Rorschach had stopped talking to us. So, do you buy it? I asked. Pattern matching, empty threats, nothing to worry about? Nobody's fired on us yet, she said, meaning not for a second. What's your take on Susan's argument? Different niches, no reason for conflict? Makes sense, I guess. Utter bullshit. Can you think of any reason why something with such different needs would attack us? That depends, she said, on whether the fact that we are different is reason enough. I saw playground battlefields reflected in her topology. I remembered my own, and wondered if there were any other kind. Then again, that only proved the point. Humans didn't really fight over skin tone or ideology. Those were just handy cues for kin selection purposes. Ultimately, it always came down to bloodlines and limited resources. I think Isaac would say this is different, I said. I guess. Bates sent one grunt humming off to the hold. 2 more emerged in formation, spine light glinting off their armor. How many of these things are you making, anyway? We're breaking and entering, Siri. Not wise to leave our own house unguarded. I inspected her surfaces as she inspected theirs. Doubt and resentment simmered just beneath. You're in a tough spot, I remarked. We all are. But you're responsible for defending us against something we don't know anything about. We're only guessing that Sarasti doesn't guess, Bates said. The man's in charge for a reason. Doesn't make much sense to question his orders, given we're all about 100 IQ points short of understanding the answer anyway. And yet he's also got that whole predatory side nobody talks about, I remarked. It must be difficult for him, all that intellect coexisting with so much instinctive aggression, making sure the right part wins. She wondered in that instant whether Sarasti might be listening in. She decided in the next that it didn't matter. Why should he care what the cattle thought, as long as they did what they were told? All she said was, I thought you Jargonauts weren't supposed to have opinions. That wasn't mine. Bates paused, returned to her inspection. You know what I do, I said. Uh-huh. The first of the current pair passed muster and hummed off up the spine. She turned to the second. You simplify things, so the folks back home can understand what the specialists are up to. That's part of it. I don't need a translator, Siri. I'm just a consultant, assuming things go well. A bodyguard if they don't. You're an officer and a military expert. I'd say that makes you more than qualified when it comes to assessing Rorschach's threat potential. I'm muscle. Shouldn't you be simplifying Yucca or Isaac? That's exactly what I'm doing. She looked at me. You interact, I said. Every component of the system affects every other. Processing Sarasti without factoring you in would be like trying to calculate acceleration while ignoring mass. She turned back to her brood. Another robot passed muster. She didn't hate me. What she hated was what my presence implied. They don't trust us to speak for ourselves, she wouldn't say. No matter how qualified we are, no matter how far ahead of the pack, maybe even because of that, we're contaminated, we're subjective. So they send Siri Keaton to tell them what we really mean. I get it, I said after a moment. Do you? It's not about trust, Major. It's about location. Nobody gets a good view of a system from the inside, no matter who they are. The view's distorted. And yours isn't. I'm outside the system. You're interacting with me now. As an observer only. Perfection's unattainable, but it isn't unapproachable, you know? I don't play a role in decision-making or research. I don't interfere in any aspect of the mission that I'm assigned to study. But of course I ask questions. The more information I have, the better my analysis. I thought you didn't have to ask. I thought you guys could just read the signs or something. Every bit helps. It all goes into the mix. You doing it now? Synthesizing? I nodded. And you do this without any specialized knowledge at all. I'm as much of a specialist as you. I specialize in processing informational topologies. Without understanding their content. Understanding their shapes is enough. Bates seemed to find some small imperfection in the BattleBot under scrutiny, scratched at its shell with a fingernail. Software couldn't do that without your help. Software can do a lot of things. We've chosen to do some for ourselves. I nodded at the grunt. Your visual inspections, for example. She smiled faintly, conceding the point. So I'd encourage you to speak freely. You know I'm sworn to confidentiality. Thanks, she said, meaning, on this ship there's no such thing. Theseus chimed. Sarasti spoke in its wake. Orbital insertion in 15 minutes. Everyone to the drum in 5. Well, Bates said, sending one last grunt on its way, here we go. She pushed off and sailed up the spine. The newborn killing machines clicked at me. They smelled like new cars. By the way, Bates called over her shoulder, you missed the obvious one. Sorry? She spun 180 degrees at the end of the passageway, landed like an acrobat beside the drum hatch. The reason. Why something would attack us even if we didn't have anything it wanted? I read it off her. If it wasn't attacking at all, if it was defending itself. You asked about Sarasti. Smart man. Strong leader. Maybe he could spend a little more time with the troops. Vampire doesn't respect his command, doesn't listen to advice, hides away half the time. I remembered transient killer whales. Maybe he's being considerate. He knows he makes us nervous. I'm sure that's it, Bates said. Vampire doesn't trust himself. It wasn't just Sarasti. They all hid from us, even when they had the upper hand. They always stayed just the other side of myth. It started pretty much the same way it did for anything else. Vampires were far from the first to learn the virtues of energy conservation. Shrews and hummingbirds, saddled with tiny bodies and overclocked metabolic engines, would have starved to death overnight if not for the torpor that overtook them at sundown. Comatose elephant seals lurked breathless at the bottom of the sea, rousing only for passing prey or redline lactate levels. Bears and chipmunks cut costs by sleeping away the impoverished winter months, and lungfish, Devonian black belts in the art of estivation, could curl up and die for years waiting for the rains. With vampires, it was a little different. It wasn't shortness of breath or metabolic overdrive or some blanket of snow that locked the pantry every winter. The problem wasn't so much a lack of prey as a lack of difference from it. Vampires were such a recent split from the ancestral baseline that the reproductive rates hadn't diverged. There was no woodland variety lynx hair dynamic where prey outnumbered predators 100 to 1. Vampires fed on things that bred barely faster than they did. They would have wiped out their own food supply in no time if they hadn't learned how to ease off on the throttle. By the time they went extinct, they'd learned to shut down for decades. It made two kinds of sense. It not only slashed their metabolic needs while prey bred itself back to harvestable levels, it gave us time to forget that we were prey. We were so smart by the Pleistocene, smart enough for easy skepticism. If you haven't seen any night-stalking demons in all your years on the savannah, why should you believe some senile campfire ramblings passed down by your mother's mother? It was murder on our ancestors, even if those same enemy genes, co-opted now, served us so well when we left the sun a half-million years later. But it was almost hardening, I guess, to think that maybe Sarasti felt the tug of other genes, some aversion to prolonged invisibility, shaped by generations of natural selection. Maybe he spent every moment in our company fighting voices that urged him to hide, hide, let them forget. Maybe he retreated when they got too loud. Maybe we made him as uneasy as he made us. We could always hope. Sorry. Our final orbit combined discretion and valor in equal measure. Rorschach described a perfect equatorial circle 87,900 kilometers from Big Ben's center of gravity. Sarasti was unwilling to let it out of sight, and you didn't have to be a vampire to mistrust relay sats when swinging through a radiation-soaked blizzard of rock and machinery. The obvious alternative was to match orbits. At the same time, all the debate over whether or not Rorschach had meant, or even understood, the threats it had made was a bit beside the point. Counter-intrusion measures were a distinct possibility either way, and ongoing proximity only increased the risk. So Sarasti derived some optimum compromise, a mildly eccentric orbit that nearly brushed the artifact at perigee but kept a discreet distance the rest of the time. It was a longer trajectory than Rorschach's, and higher. We had to burn on the descending arc to keep in sync, but the end result was continuously line of sight, and only brought us within striking distance for 3 hours either side of bottoming out. Our striking distance, that is. For all we knew, Rorschach could have reached out and swatted us from the sky before we'd even left the solar system. Sarasti gave the command from his tent. Consensus carried his voice into the drum as Theseus coasted to apogee. Now! Jack had erected a tent about itself, a blister glued to Rorschach's hull and blown semi-taut against vacuum with the merest whiff of nitrogen. Now it brought lasers to bear and started digging. If we'd read the vibrations right, the ground should be only 34 centimeters deep beneath its feet. The beams stuttered as they cut, despite 6 millimeters of doped shielding.
Son of a bitch, Spindle muttered. It's working.
We burned through tough, fibrous epidermis. We burned through veins of insulation that might have been some sort of programmable asbestos. We burned through alternating layers of superconducting mesh and the strata of flaking carbon separating them. We burned through. The lasers shut down instantly. Within seconds, Rorschach's intestinal gases had blown taut the skin of the tent. Black carbon smoke swirled and danced in sudden, thick atmosphere. Nothing shot back at us. Nothing reacted. Partial pressures piled up on Consensus. Methane, ammonia, hydrogen. Lots of water vapor, freezing as fast as it registered. Spindle grunted.
Reducing atmosphere. Pre-snowball.
He sounded disappointed. Maybe it's a work in progress, James suggested, like the structure itself.
Maybe.
Jack stuck out its tongue, a giant mechanical sperm with a myo-optical tail. Its head was a thick-skinned lozenge, at least half ceramic shielding by cross-section. The tiny payload of sensors at its core was rudimentary, but small enough for the whole assembly to thread through the pencil-thin hole the laser had cut. It unspooled down the hole, rimming Rorschach's newly torn orifice. Dark down there, James observed. Bates. But warm. 281 degrees Kelvin. Above freezing. The endoscope emerged into darkness. Infrared served up a grainy grayscale of a tunnel, it looked like, replete with mist and exotic rock formations. The walls curved like honeycomb, like the insides of fossilized intestine. Cul-de-sacs and branches proliferated down the passage. The basic substrate appeared to be a dense pastry of carbon fiber leaves. Some of the gaps between those layers were barely thick as fingernails. Others looked wide enough to stack bodies.
Ladies and gentlemen, Spindle said softly, the devil's baklava.
I could have sworn I saw something move. I could have sworn it looked familiar. The camera died. Ooh, excuse me. We can get to the next part of the book, which is titled This is part 2. Rorschach. Part 2. Rorschach. Mothers are fonder than fathers of their children because they are more certain they are their own. Aristotle. I couldn't say goodbye to Dad. I didn't even know where he was. I didn't want to say goodbye to Helen. I didn't want to go back there. That was the problem. I didn't have to. There was nowhere left in the world where the mountain couldn't simply pick up and move to Mohammed. Heaven was merely a suburb of the global village, and the global village left me no excuse. I linked from my own apartment. My new inlays, mission-specific, slid into my head just the week before, shook hands with the noosphere, and knocked upon the pearly gates. Some tame spirit, more plausible than St. Peter, if no less ethereal, took a message and disappeared. And I was inside. This was no antechamber, no visiting room. Heaven was not intended for the casual visitor. Any paradise in which the flesh-constrained world would feel at home would have been intolerably pedestrian to the disembodied souls who lived there. Of course, there was no reason why visitor and resident had to share the same view. I could have pulled any conventional worldview off the shelf if I'd wanted, seen this place rendered in any style I chose. Except for the Ascended themselves, of course. That was one of the perks of the afterlife. Only they got to choose the face that we saw. But the thing my mother had become had no face, and I was damned if she was going to see me hide behind some mask. "Hello, Helen." "Siri, what a wonderful surprise!" She was an abstraction in an abstraction, an impossible intersection of dozens of bright panes, as if the disassembled tiles of a stained glass window had each been set aglow and animated. She swirled before me like a school of fish. Her world echoed her body, lights and angles and three-dimensional Escher impossibilities piled like bright thunderheads. And yet, somehow, I would have recognized her anywhere. Heaven was a dream. Only upon waking do you realize that the characters you encountered looked nothing like they do in real life. There was only one familiar landmark anywhere in the whole sensorium. My mother's heaven smelled of cinnamon. I beheld her luminous avatar, and imagined the corpus soaking in a tank of nutrients deep underground. "How are you doing?" "Very well, very well. Of course it takes a little getting used to, knowing your mind isn't quite yours anymore." Heaven didn't just feed the brains of its residents. It fed off them, used the surplus power of idle synapses to run its own infrastructure. "You have to move in here, sooner better than later. You'll never leave." "Actually, I am leaving," I said. "We're shipping out tomorrow." "Shipping out?" "The Kuiper. You know, the fireflies." "Oh, yes. I think I heard something about that. We don't get much news from the outside world, you know." "Anyway, just thought I'd call in and say goodbye." "I'm glad you did. I've been hoping to see you without, you know." "Without what?" "You know, without your father listening in." Not again. "Dad's in the field, Helen. Interplanetary crisis. You might have heard something." "I certainly have. You know, I haven't always been happy about your father's extended assignments, but maybe it was really a blessing in disguise. The less he was around, the less he could do." "Do?" "To you." The apparition stilled for a few moments, feigning hesitation. "I've never told you this before, but no, I shouldn't." "Shouldn't what?" "Bring up, well, old hurts." "What old hurts?" Right on cue. I couldn't help myself. The training went too deep. I always barked on command. "Well," she began, "sometimes you'd come back. You were so very young, and your face would be so set and hard, and I'd wonder why you so angry, little boy? What can someone so young have to be so angry about?" "Helen, what are you talking about? Back from where?" "Just from the places he'd take you." Something like a shiver passed across her facets. "He was still around back then. He wasn't so important. He was just an accountant with a karate fetish, going on about forensics and game theory and astronomy until he put everyone to sleep." I tried to imagine it. My father, the chatterbox. That doesn't sound like Dad.
"Well, of course not. You were too young to remember, but he was just a little man then. He still is, really, under all the secret missions and classified briefings. I've never understood why people never saw that. But even back then he liked to. Well, it wasn't his fault, I suppose. He had a very difficult childhood, and he never learned to deal with problems like an adult. He'd throw his weight around, I guess you'd say. Of course, I didn't know that before we married. If I had, But I made a commitment. I made a commitment, and I never broke it."
What, are you saying you were abused?
"Back from the places he'd take you."
Are are you saying I was?
"There are all kinds of abuse, Siri. Words can hurt more than bullets sometimes. And child abandonment. He didn't abandon me. He left me with you. He abandoned us, Siri, sometimes for months at a time, and we never knew if he was coming back. And he chose to do that to us, Siri. He didn't need that job. There were so many other things he was qualified to do, things that had been redundant for years.
I shook my head, incredulous, unable to say it aloud. She hated him because he hadn't had the good grace to grow unnecessary? It's not Dad's fault that planetary security is still an essential service, I said. She continued as if she hadn't heard.
Now, there was a time when it was unavoidable, when people our age had to work just to make ends meet. But even back then, people wanted to spend time with their families, even if they couldn't afford to. To to choose to stay working when it isn't even necessary, that's...
She shattered and reassembled at my shoulder.
Yes, Siri, I believe that's a kind of abuse. And if your father had been half as loyal to me as I've been to him all these years...
I remembered Jim, the last time I'd seen him, snorting vasopressin under the restless eyes of robot sentries. I don't think Dad's been disloyal to either of us.
Helen sighed. I don't really expect you to understand. I'm not completely stupid. I've seen how it played out. I pretty much had to raise you myself all those years. I had to I always had to play the heavy, always had to be the one to hand out the discipline, because your father was off on some secret assignment. And then he'd come home for a week or two, and he was the golden-haired boy just because he'd seen fit to drop in. I don't really blame you for that any more than I blame him. Blame doesn't solve anything at this stage. I just thought, well, really, I thought you ought to know. Take it for what it's worth.
A memory, unbidden, called into Helen's bed when I was 9, her hand stroking my scar, her stale, sweet breath stirring against my cheek.
You're the man of the house now, Siri. We can't count on your father anymore. It's just you and me.
I didn't say anything for a while. Finally, didn't it help at all?
What do you mean?
I glanced around at all that customized abstraction, internal feedback lucidly dreamed. You're omnipotent in here. Desire anything, imagine anything, there it is. I thought it would have changed you more. Rainbow Tiles danced and forced a laugh.
This isn't enough of a change for you?
Not nearly, because heaven had a catch. No matter how many constructs and avatars Helen built in there, no matter how many empty vessels sang her praises or commiserated over the injustices she'd suffered, when it came right down to it, she was only talking to herself. There were other realities over which she had no control, other people who didn't play by her rules. And if they thought of Helen at all, they thought as they damn well pleased. She could go the rest of her life without ever meeting any of them. But she knew they were out there, and it drove her crazy. Taking my leave of heaven, it occurred to me that, omnipotent though she was, there was only one way my mother would ever be truly happy in her own personal creation. The rest of creation would have to go.
This shouldn't keep happening, Bates said. The shielding was good.
The gang was up across the drums, squaring away something in their tent. Sarasti lurked off stage today, monitoring the proceedings from his quarters. That left me with Bates and Spindle in the commons.
Maybe against direct EM, Spindle stretched, stifled a yawn. Ultrasound boots up magnetic fields through shielding sometimes, in living tissue at least. Any chance something like that could be happening with your electronics?
Bates spread her hands.
Who knows? Might as well be black magic and elves down there. Well, it's not a total wash. We can make a few smart guesses, eh?
Such as? Spindle raised one finger.
The layers we cut through couldn't result from any metabolic process I know about, so it's not alive, not in the biological sense. Not that that means anything these days, he added, glancing around the belly of our beast.
What about life inside the structure?
Anoxic atmosphere probably rules out complex multicellular life. Microbes, maybe, although if so, I wish to hell they'd show up in the samples. But anything complex enough to think, let alone build something like that? A wave at the image in consensus. It's going to need a high energy metabolism, and that means oxygen.
So you think it's empty?
Didn't say that, did I? I know aliens are supposed to be all mysterious and everything, but I still don't see why anyone would build a city-sized wildlife refuge for anaerobic microbes.
It's got to be a habitat for something. Why any atmosphere at all if it's just some kind of terraforming machine?
Spindle pointed up at the gang's tent. What Susan said. Atmosphere's still under construction, and we get a free ride until the owners show up.
Free?
Free-ish. And I know we've only seen a fraction of what's inside. But something obviously saw us coming. It yelled at us, as I recall. If they're smart and they're hostile, why aren't they shooting?
Maybe they are.
If something's hiding down the hall, wrecking your robots, it's not frying them any faster than the baseline environment would do anyway.
What you call a baseline environment might be an active counter-intrusion measure. Why else would a habitat be so uninhabitable?
Spindle rolled his eyes. Okay, I was wrong. We don't know enough to make a few smart guesses.
Not that we hadn't tried. Once Jack's sensor head had been irreparably fried, we'd relegated it to surface excavation. It had widened the bore in infinitesimal increments, patiently burning back the edges of our initial peephole until it measured almost a meter across. Meanwhile, we'd customized Bates's grunts, shielded them against nuclear reactors and the insides of cyclotrons, and, come perigee, we'd thrown them at Rorschach like stones chucked into a haunted forest. Each had gone through Jack's portal, unspooling whisker-thin fiber op behind them to pass intelligence through the charged atmosphere. They'd sent glimpses, mostly, a few extended vignettes. We'd seen Rorschach's walls move, slow, lazy waves of peristalsis rippling along its gut. We'd seen treacly invaginations in progress, painstaking constrictions that would presumably, given time, seal off a passageway. Our grunts had sailed through some quarters, staggered through others where the magnetic ambiance threw them off balance. They'd passed through strange throats lined with razor-thin teeth, thousands of triangular blades in parallel rows, helically twisted. They'd edged cautiously around clouds of mist sculpted into abstract fractal shapes, shifting and endlessly recursive, their charged droplets strung along a myriad of converging lines of electromagnetic force. Ultimately, every one of them had died or disappeared. Any way to increase the shielding? I wondered. Spindle gave me a look. We've shielded everything except the sensor heads, Bates explained. If we lose those, we're blind. But visible light's harmless enough. What about purely optical light?
We're using optical links, Commissar, Spindle snapped, and you may have noticed the shit's getting through anyway.
But aren't there, I groped for the word, bandpass filters? Something that lets visible wavelengths through, cuts out the lethal stuff on both sides? He snorted.
Sure. It's called an atmosphere, and if we'd brought one with us, about 50 times deeper than Earth's, it might block some of that soup down there. Of course, Earth also gets a lot of help from its magnetic field, but I'm not betting my life on any EM we set up in that place.
If we didn't keep running into these spikes, Bates said. That's the real problem. Are they random? I wondered. Spindle's shrug was half shiver.
I don't think anything about that place is random. But who knows? We need more data.
Which we're not likely to get, James said, walking around the ceiling to join us, if our drones keep shorting out. The conditional was pure formality. We'd tried playing the odds, sacrificing drone after drone in the hope that one of them would get lucky. Survival rates tailed exponentially to zero with distance from base camp. We'd tried shielding the fiber op to reduce aperture leakage. The resulting tethers were stiff and unwieldy, wrapped in so many layers of ferroceramic that we were virtually waving the bots around on the end of a stick. We'd tried cutting the tethers entirely, sending the machines out to explore on their own, squinting against the radiant blizzard and storing their findings for later download. None had returned. We'd tried everything.
We can go in ourselves, James said.
Almost everything.
Right,
Spindle replied in a voice that couldn't mean anything but wrong.
It's the only way to learn anything useful.
Yeah, like how many seconds it would take your brain to turn into synchrotron soup.
Our suits can be shielded.
Oh, you mean like Mandy's drones?
I'd really rather you didn't call me that, Bates remarked.
The point is, the point is, Rorschach kills you whether you're meat or mechanical.
My point is, it kills meat differently, Bates remarked.
James replied,
Sorry. It takes longer.
Spindle shook his head.
You'd be good as dead in 50 minutes, even shielded, even in the so-called cool zones.
And completely asymptomatic for 3 hours or more. And even after that, it would take days for us to actually die, and we'd be back here long before then, and the ship could patch us up just like that. We even know that much, Isaac. It's right there in consensus. And if we know it, you know it. So we shouldn't even be having this argument.
What's your solution? We saturate ourselves with radiation every 30 hours, and then I get to cut out the tumors and stitch everyone's cells back together?
The pods are automatic. You wouldn't have to lift a finger.
Not to mention the number those magnetic fields would do on your brain. We'd be hallucinating from the moment we
Faraday the suits.
Ah, so we go in deaf, dumb, and blind. Good idea.
We can let light pass, infrared.
It's all EM, Suze. Even if we blacked out our helmets completely and used a camera feed, we'd get leakage where the wire went through.
Some, yes, but it'd be better than...
Jesus.
A tremor sent spittle sailing from the corner of Spindle's mouth.
Let me talk to Miss...
I've discussed it with the rest of the gang, Isaac. We're all agreed.
All agreed? You don't have a working majority in there, Suze. Just because you cut your brain into pieces doesn't mean they each get a vote.
I don't see why not. We're each at least as sentient as you are.
They're all you, just partitioned.
You don't seem to have any trouble treating Michelle as a separate individual.
Michelle's... yes, you're all very different facets, but there's only one original. Your alters...
Don't call us that, Sasha erupted with a voice cold as Locke's. Ever.
Spindle tried to pull back.
I didn't mean... You know I didn't...
But Sasha was gone.
What are you saying? Said the softer voice in her wake. Do you think I'm just mom play acting? I'm just mom play acting? You think when we're together you're alone with her?
Michelle, Spindle said miserably. No, what I think...
Doesn't matter, Sarasti said. We don't vote here. He floated above us, visored and unreadable in the center of the drum. None of us had seen him arrive. He turned slowly on his axis, keeping us in view as we rotated around him. Prepping Scylla. Amanda needs 2 untethered grunts with precautionary armament. Chems from 1 to 1,000,000 angstroms, shielded tympanics, no autonomous circuitry. Platelet boosters, diamond hydronate and potassium iodide for everyone by 1350.
Everyone? Bates asked.
Sarasti nodded. Window opens 4 hours 23. He turned back down the spine. Not me. Not me, I said. Sarasti paused. I don't participate in field ops, I reminded him. Now you do.
I'm a synthesist.
He knew that. Of course he knew. Everyone did. You can't observe the system unless you stay outside the system. On Earth you're a synthesist, he said. In the Kuiper you're a synthesist. Here, your mass. Do what you're told. He disappeared.
Welcome to the big picture, Bates said softly.
I looked at her as the rest of the group broke up.
You know We're a long way out, Siri. Can't wait 14 months for feedback from your bosses, and you know it.
She leaped from a standing start, arced smoothly through holograms into the weightless core of the drum. But then she stopped herself, as if distracted by some sudden insight. She grabbed a spinal conduit and swung back to face me.
You shouldn't sell yourself short, she said. Or Sarasti either. You're an observer, right? It's a safe bet there's going to be a lot down there worth observing.
Thanks, I said, but I already knew why Sarasti was sending me into Rorschach, and there was more to it than observation. 3 valuable agents in harm's way. A decoy bought 1 in 4 odds that an enemy would aim somewhere else. The Lord will take control of you. You will dance and shout and become a different person. 1 Samuel 10:6.
We were probably fractured during most of our evolution, James once told me, back when we were still all getting acquainted. She tapped her temple. There's a lot of room up here. A modern brain can run dozens of sentient cores without getting too crowded. And parallel multitasking has obvious survival advantages.
I nodded. 10 heads are better than 1.
Our integration may have actually occurred quite recently. Some experts think we can still revert to multiples under the right circumstances.
Well, of course. You're living proof.
She shook their head. I'm not talking about physical partitioning. We're the state of the art, certainly, but theoretically surgery isn't even necessary. Simple stress could do something like it if it was strong enough, if it happened early in childhood.
No kidding.
Well, in theory, James admitted, and changed into Sasha, who said, Bullshit in theory. There's documented cases as recently as 50 years ago.
Really? I resisted the temptation to look it up on my inlays. The unfocused eyes could be a giveaway. I didn't know.
Well, it's not like anyone talks about it now. People were fucking barbarians about multicores back then. Called it a disorder. Treated it like some kind of disease. And their idea of a cure was to keep one of the cores and murder all the others. Not that they called it murder, of course. They called it integration or some shite. That's what people did back then. Created other people to suck up all the abuse and torture, then got rid of them when they weren't needed anymore.
It hadn't been the tone most of us were looking for at an ice-breaking party. James had gently eased back into the driver's seat and the conversation had steered closer to community standards. But I hadn't heard any of the gang use alter to describe each other, then or since. It had seemed innocuous enough when Spindle had said it. I wondered why they'd taken such offense. And now, floating alone in my tent with a few pre-op minutes to kill, there was no one to see my eyes glaze. Alter carried baggage over a century old, Consensus told me. Sasha was right. There'd been a time when MCC was MPD, a disorder rather than a complex, and it had never been induced deliberately. According to the experts of that time, multiple personalities arose spontaneously from unimaginable cauldrons of abuse. Fragmentary personae offered up to suffer rapes and beatings, while the child behind took to some unknowable sanctuary in the folds of the brain. It was both survival strategy and ritual self-sacrifice. Powerless souls hacking themselves to pieces, offering up quivering chunks of self in the desperate hope that the vengeful gods called Mom or Dad might not be insatiable. None of it had been real, as it turned out. Or at least, none of it had been confirmed. The experts of the day had been little more than witch doctors dancing through improvised rituals, meandering free-form interviews full of leading questions and nonverbal cues, scavenger hunts through regurgitated childhoods. Sometimes a shot of lithium or haloperidol when the beads and rattles didn't work. The technology to map minds was barely off the ground. The technology to edit them was years away. So the therapists and psychiatrists poked at their victims and invented names for things they didn't understand, and argued over the shrines of Freud and Klein and the old astrologers, doing their very best to sound like practitioners of science. Inevitably, it was science that turned them all into roadkill. MPD was a half-forgotten fad even before the advent of synaptic rewiring. But alter was a word from that time, and its resonance had persisted. Among those who remembered the tale, alter was code speak for betrayal and human sacrifice. Alter meant cannon fodder. Imagining the topology of the gang's coexisting souls, I could see why Sasha embraced the mythology. I could see why Susan let her. After all, there was nothing implausible about the concept. The gang's very existence proved that much. And when you've been peeled off from a pre-existing entity, sculpted from non-existence straight into adulthood, a mere fragment of personhood without even a full-time body to call your own, you can be forgiven a certain amount of anger. Sure, you're all equal, all in it together. Sure, no persona is better than any other. Susan's still the only one with a surname. Better to direct that resentment at old grudges, real or imagined. Less problematic, at least, than taking it out on someone who shares the same flesh. I realized something else, too. Surrounded by displays documenting the relentless growth of the Leviathan beneath us, I could not only see why Sasha had objected to the word, I could also see why Isaac Spindle, no doubt unconsciously, had spoken it in the first place. As far as Earth was concerned, everyone on Theseus was an alter. Sarasti stayed behind. He hadn't come with a backup. There were the rest of us, though, crammed into the shuttle, embedded in custom spacesuits so padded with shielding we might have been deep-sea divers from a previous century. It was a fine balance. Too much shielding would have been worse than none at all, would split primary particles into secondary ones, just as lethal and twice as numerous. Sometimes you had to live with moderate exposure. The only alternative was to embed yourself like a bug in lead. We launched 6 hours from Perigee. Scylla raced on ahead like an eager child, leaving its parent behind. There was no eagerness in the systems around me, though. Except for one, the gang of four almost shimmered behind her faceplate. Excited? I asked. Sasha answered, Fucking right. Field work, Keaton. First contact. What if there's nobody there? What if there is, and they don't like us? Even better. We get a crack at their signs and cereal boxes without the traffic cops leaning over our shoulders. I wondered if she spoke for the others. I was pretty sure she didn't speak for Michelle. Scylla's ports had all been sealed. There was no outside view, nothing to see inside but bots and bodies and the tangled silhouette swelling on my helmet HUD. But I could feel the radiation slicing through our armor as if it were tissue paper. I could feel the knotted crests and troughs of Rorschach's magnetic field. I could feel Rorschach itself, drawing nearer. The charred canopy of some firestormed alien forest, more landscape than artifact. I imagined titanic bolts of electricity arcing between its branches. I imagined getting in the way. What kind of creatures would choose to live in such a place? You really think we'll get along? I said. James's shrug was all but lost under the armor. Maybe not at first. We may have gotten off on the wrong foot. We might have to sort through all kinds of misunderstandings. But we'll figure each other out eventually. Evidently, she thought that had answered my question. The shuttle slewed. We bumped against each other like tenpins. 30 seconds of micromaneuvers brought us to a solid stop. A cheery animation played across the HUD in greens and blues, the shuttle's docking seal easing through the membrane that served as our entrance into Rorschach's inflatable vestibule. Even as a cartoon, it looked vaguely pornographic. Bates had been pre-packed next to the airlock. She slid back the inner door. "Everybody duck." Not an easy maneuver, swaddled in life support and ferroceramic. Helmets tilted and bumped. The grunts, flattened overhead like great lethal cockroaches, hummed to life and disengaged from the ceiling. They scraped past in the narrow headroom, bobbed cryptically to their mistress, and exited stage left. Bates closed the inner hatch. The lock cycled, opened again on an empty chamber. Everything nominal, according to the board. The drones waited patiently in the vestibule. Nothing had jumped out at them. Bates followed them through. We had to wait forever for the image. The baud rate was less than a trickle. Words moved back and forth easily enough. "No surprises so far," Bates reported in distorted Jew's harp vibrato. But any picture was worth a million of them, and there, through the eyes of the grunt behind, we saw the grunt ahead in motionless, grainy monochrome. It was a postcard from the past. Sight turned to sound, thick, clumsy vibrations of methane bumping against the hull. It took long seconds for each static-ridden image to accrete on the HUD. Grunts descending into the pit, grunts emerging into Rorschach's duodenum, a cryptic, hostile cavescape in some systematic increments. Down in the lower left-hand corner of each image, timestamps and Teslas ran down the clock. You give up a lot when you don't trust the EM spectrum. "Looks good," Bates reported. "Going in." In a friendlier universe, machines would have cruised the boulevard, sending perfect images in crystal resolution. Spindle and the gang would be sipping coffee back in the drum, telling the grunts to take a sample of this or get a close-up of that. In a friendlier universe, I wouldn't even be here. Bates appeared in the next postcard, emerging from the fistula. In the next, her back was to the camera, apparently panning the perimeter. In the one after that, she was looking right at us. "Oh, okay," she said. "Come on, down."
Not so fast, Spindle said. How are you feeling?
"Fine. A bit odd, but..."
Odd how?
Radiation sickness announced itself with nausea, but unless we'd seriously erred in our calculations, that wouldn't happen for another hour or two. Not until well after we'd all been lethally cooked. "Mild disorientation," Bates reported. "It's a bit spooky in here, but must be Gray syndrome. It's tolerable." I looked at the gang. The gang looked at Spindle. Spindle shrugged. "It's not going to get any better," Bates said from afar. "The clock is ticking, people. Get down here." We got. Not living. Not by a long shot. Haunted. Even when the walls didn't move, they did. Always at the corner of the eye, that sense of crawling motion. Always at the back of the mind, the sense of being watched, the dread certainty of malign and alien observers just out of sight. More than once I turned, expecting to catch one of those phantoms in the open. All I ever saw was a half-blind grunt floating down the passageway, or a wide-eyed and jittery crewmate returning my stare. And the walls of some glistening black lava tube with 100 embedded eyes, all snapped shut just the instant before. Our lights pushed the darkness back perhaps 20 meters in either direction. Beyond, mist and shadows seethed. And the sounds! Rorschach creaked around us like some ancient wooden hull trapped in pack ice. Electricity hissed like rattlesnakes. You tell yourself it's mostly in your head. You remind yourself it's well documented, an inevitable consequence of meat and magnetism brought too close together. High energy fields release the ghosts and the grays from your temporal lobe, dredge up paralyzing dread from the midbrain to saturate the conscious mind. They fuck with your motor nerves and make even dormant inlays sing like fine, fragile crystal. Energy artifacts. That's all they are. You repeat that to yourself. You repeat it so often it loses any pretense of rationality and devolves into rote incantation, a spell to ward off evil spirits. They're not real, these whispering voices just outside your helmet, those half-seen creatures flickering at the edge of vision. They're tricks of the mind, the same neurological smoke and mirrors that convinced people throughout the ages that they were being haunted by ghosts, abducted by aliens, hunted by vampires. And you wonder whether Sarasti really stayed behind, or if he was here all along, waiting for you. Another spike, Bates warned as Tesla and Sieverts surged on my head. Hang on. I was installing the Faraday bell. Trying to. It should have been simple enough. I'd already run the main anchor line down from the vestibule to the flaccid sacks floating in the middle of the passageway. That's right, something about a spring line to keep the bell centered. The wall glistened in my headlamp like wet clay. Satanic runes sparkled in my imagination. I jammed the spring line's pad against the wall. I could have sworn the substrate flinched. I fired my thrust pistol, retreated back to the center of the passage. "They're here," James whispered. Something was. I could feel it always behind me, no matter where I turned. I could feel some great roaring darkness swirling just out of sight, a ravenous mouth as wide as the tunnel itself. Any moment now it would lunge forward at impossible speed and engulf us all. "They're beautiful," James said. There was no fear in her voice at all. She sounded awestruck. "What? Where?" Bates never stopped turning, kept trying to keep the whole 360 in sight at once. The drones under her command wobbled restlessly to either side, armored parentheses pointing down the passageway in opposite directions. "What do you see?" "Not out there. In here. Everywhere. Can't you see it?"
I can't see anything, Spindle said, his voice shaking.
"It's in the EM fields," James said. "That's how they communicate. The whole structure is full of language.
I can't see anything, Spindle repeated.
His breath echoed loud and fast over the link.
I'm blind!
Shit! Bates swung on Spindle. How can that...
The radiation, don't think that's it.
9 Tesla, and the ghosts were everywhere. I smelled asphalt and honeysuckle.
Keaton, Bates called. You with us?
Yeah, barely. I was back at the bell, my hand on the ripcord, trying to ignore whatever kept tapping me on the shoulder.
Leave that. Get him outside.
No. Spindle floated helplessly in the passage, his pistol bouncing against its wrist tether.
No, throw me something.
What? It's all in your head. It's all in your...
Throw something, anything.
Bates hesitated. You said you were blind.
Just do it.
Bates pulled a spare suit battery off her belt and lobbed it. Spindle reached, fumbled. The battery slipped from his grasp and bounced off the wall.
I'll be okay, he gasped. Just get me into the tent.
I yanked the cord. The bell inflated like a great gunmetal marshmallow. Everyone inside. Bates ran her pistol with one hand, grabbed Spindle with the other. She handed him off to me and slapped a sensor pod onto the skin of the tent. I pulled back the shielded entrance flap as though pulling a scab from a wound. The single molecule beneath, infinitely long, endlessly folded against itself, swirled and glistened like a soap bubble.
Get him in. James, get down here.
I pushed Spindle through the membrane. It split around him with airtight intimacy, hugged each tiny crack and contour as he passed through.
James, are you...
Get it off me! Harsh voice, raw and scared and scary. As male as female could sound. Cruncher in control. Get it off! I looked back. Susan James's body tumbled slowly in the tunnel, grasping its right leg with both hands. James! Bates sailed over to the other woman. Keaton, help out! She took the gang by the arm. Cruncher, what's the problem? That! You blind! He wasn't just grasping at the limb, I realized as I joined them. He was tugging at it. He was trying to pull it off. Something laughed hysterically right inside my helmet. Take his arm, Bates told me, taking his right one, trying to pry the fingers from their death grip on the gang's leg. Cruncher, let go. Now. Get it off me! It's your leg, Cruncher. We wrestled our way toward the diving bell. It's not my leg. Just look at it. How could it? It's dead. It's stuck to me. Almost there. Cruncher, listen, Bates snapped. Are you with me? Get it off! We stuffed the gang into the tent. Bates moved aside as I dove in after them. Amazing the way she held it together. Somehow she kept the demons at bay, herded us to shelter like a border collie in a thunderstorm. She wasn't following us in. She wasn't even there. I turned to see her body floating outside the tent, one gloved hand grasping the edge of the flap. But even under all those layers of captain and chromal and polycarbonate, even behind the distorted half reflections on her faceplate, I could tell that something was missing. All her surfaces had just disappeared. This couldn't be Amanda Bates. The thing before me had no more topology than a mannequin. Amanda? The gang gibbered at my back, softly hysteric. Spindle.
What's happening?
I'll stay out here, Bates said. She had no affect whatsoever. I'm dead anyway.
What? Spindle had lots. You will be if you don't.
You leave me here, Bates said. That's an order. She sealed us in. It wasn't the first time, not for me. I'd had invisible fingers poking through my brain before, stirring up the muck, ripping open the scabs. It was far more intense when Rorschach did it to me, but Chelsea was more precise, I guess you'd say. Macrame, she called it. Glial jump starts, cascade effects, the splice and dice of critical ganglia. While I trafficked in the reading of human architecture, Chelsea changed it, finding the critical nodes and nudging them just so, dropping a pebble into some trickle at the headwaters of memory and watching the ripples build to a great rolling cascade deep in the downstream psyche. She could hotwire happiness in the time it took to fix a sandwich, reconcile you with your whole childhood in the course of a lunch hour or three. Like so many other domains of human invention, this one had learned to run without her. Human nature was becoming an assembly line edit, humanity itself increasingly relegated from production to product. Still, for me, Chelsea's skill set recast a strange old world in an entirely new light. The cut and paste of minds not for the greater good of some abstract society, but for the simple selfish wants of the individual. Let me give you the gift of happiness, she said. I'm already pretty happy. I'll make you happier. A tat on me. Tat? Transient attitudinal tweak. I've still got privileges at Saks. I've been tweaked plenty. Change one more synapse and I might turn into someone else. That's ridiculous and you know it, or every experience you had would turn you into a different person. I thought about that. Maybe it does. But she wouldn't let it go, and even the strongest anti-happiness argument was bound to be an uphill proposition, so one afternoon Chelsea fished around in her cupboards and dredged up a hairnet studded with greasy gray washers. The net was a superconducting spiderweb, fine as mist, that mapped the fields of merest thought. The washers were ceramic magnets that bathed the brain in fields of their own. Chelsea's inlays linked to a base station that played with the interference patterns between the two. They used to need a machine the size of a bathroom just to house the magnets. She laid me back on the couch and stretched the mesh across my skull. That's the only outright miracle you get with a portable setup like this. We can find hot spots, and we can even zap 'em if they need zapping, but the TMS effects fade after a while. We'll have to go to a clinic for anything permanent. So we're fishing for what, exactly? Repressed memories? No such thing. She grinned in toothy reassurance. There are only memories we choose to ignore, or kinda think around, if you know what I mean. I thought this was a gift of happiness. Why, she laid a fingertip across my lips. Believe it or not, Siggers, people sometimes choose to ignore even good memories. Like, say, if they enjoyed something they didn't think they should, or, she kissed my forehead, if they don't think they deserve to be happy. So we're going for potluck. You can never tell till you get a bite. Close your eyes. A soft hum started up somewhere between my ears. Chelsea's voice led me on through the darkness. Now keep in mind, memories aren't historical archives. They're improvisations, really. A lot of the stuff you associate with a particular event might be factually wrong, no matter how clearly you remember it. The brain has a funny habit of building composites, inserting details after the fact. Well, that's not to say your memories aren't true, okay? They're an honest reflection of how you saw the world, and every one of them went into shaping how you see it. But they're not photographs, more like impressionist paintings. Okay? Okay. Ah, she said. There's something. What? Functional cluster. Getting a lot of low-level use, but not enough to intrude into conscious awareness. Let's just see what happens when we... And I was 10 years old, and I was home early, and I'd just let myself back into the kitchen, and the smell of burned butter and garlic hung in the air. Dad and Helen were fighting in the next room. The flip top on our kitchen catcher had been left up, which was sometimes enough to get Helen going all by itself. But they were fighting about something else. Helen only wanted what was best for all of us, but Dad said there were limits and this was not the way to go about it. And Helen said, "You don't know what it's like. You hardly ever even see him." And then I knew they were fighting about me, which in and of itself was nothing unusual. What really scared me was that for the first time ever, Dad was fighting back. You do not force something like that onto someone, especially without their knowledge. My father never shouted. His voice was as low and level as ever, but it was colder than I'd ever heard and hard as iron. "That's just garbage," Helen said. "Parents always make decisions for their children in their best interests, especially when it comes to medical issues." "This is not a medical issue." This time my father's voice did rise. "It's
"Not a medical issue. That's a new height of denial even for you. They cut out half his brain, in case you missed it. Do you think he can recover from that without help? Is that more of your father's tough love shining through? Why not just deny him food and water while you're at it?"
If MUOPs were called for, they'd have been prescribed." I felt my face scrunching at the unfamiliar word. Something small and white beckoned from the open garbage pail.
"Jim, be reasonable. He's so distant. He barely even talks to me."
They said it would take time.
"But 2 years! There's nothing wrong with helping nature along a little. We're not even talking black market. It's over the counter, for God's sake."
That's not the point.
An empty pill bottle. That's what one of them had thrown out before forgetting to close the lid. I salvaged it from the kitchen discards and sounded out the label in my head. "Maybe the point should be that someone who's barely home 3 months of the year has got a bloody nerve passing judgment on my parenting skills. If you want a say in how he's raised, then you can damn well pay some dues first. Until then, just fuck right off."
You will not put that shit into my son ever again, my father said. Bond fast, Formula 4. I think that's what gamma opioid receptor promoters maternal response stimulant, strengthening ties between mother and child since 2042.
Yeah, and how are you going to stop me, you little geek? You can't even make the time to find out what's going on in your own family. You think you can control me from all the way from fucking orbit? You think...
Suddenly, nothing came from the living room but soft choking sounds. I peeked around the corner. My father had Helen by the throat.
I think, he growled, that I can stop you from doing anything to Siri ever again if I have to. And I think you know that.
And then she saw me. And then he did. And my father took his hand from around my mother's neck, and his face was utterly unreadable. But there was no mistaking the triumph on hers. I was up off the couch, the skull cap clenched in one hand. Chelsea stood wide-eyed before me, the butterfly still as death on her cheekbone. She shook my hand. "Oh, God, I'm so sorry." You saw that?" "No, of course not. I can't read minds. But that obviously wasn't a happy memory." "It wasn't all that bad. I felt sharp, disembodied pain from somewhere nearby, like an ink spot on a white tablecloth. After a moment I fixed it, teeth in my lip. She ran her hand up my arm. "It really stressed you out. Your vitals were... Are you okay?" "Yeah, of course. No big deal." Tasting salt. "I am curious about something, though." "Ask me. Why would you do this to me?" "Because we can make it go away, Cygnus. That's the whole point. Whatever that was, whatever you didn't like about it, we know where it is now. We can go back in and damp it out just... Oh my goodness. Just like that. And then we've got days to get it removed permanently, if that's what you want. Just put the cap back on and... She pulled her arms around me, drew me close. She smelled like sand and sweat. I loved the way she smelled. For a while, I could feel a little bit safe. For a while, I could feel like the bottom wasn't going to drop out at any moment. Somehow, when I was with Chelsea, I mattered. I wanted her to hold me forever. "I don't think so," I said. "No?" She blinked, looked up at me. "Why ever not?" I shrugged. "You know what they say about people who don't remember the past." Sorry. So yeah, we learned that Siri, who we were pretty sure had a pretty fucked up childhood, had an extremely fucked up childhood. Let's see. Where's the next? Because my time is growing limited. Oh yeah, we can do that. That'll be fine. Sorry. Whew.
Frog in my throat.
Actually, it's not so much a frog as it is like scratchy. Makes me want to cough. It's really annoying.
How's my cat doing? He's snoozing. He's snoozing on a toasty electric pad. That's the way it should be. Electric heating pad underneath a cat for warmth.
Because they like to. I think their normal body temperature is something like 102, 110 degrees. They're pretty warm.
Toasty.
So he likes being toasty. He's a sweetie. He's old. Predators run for their dinner. Prey run for their lives. Old ecologist's proverb. We were blind and helpless, jammed into a fragile bubble behind enemy lines. But finally the whispers were silent. The monsters had stayed beyond the covers. And Amanda Bates was out there with them.
What the fuck?
Spindle breathed. The eyes behind his faceplate were active and searching. "You can see?" I asked. He nodded.
What happened to Bates? Her suit breach?
"I don't think so."
Then why'd she say she was dead? What?
"She meant it literally," I told him. "Not, I'm as good as dead or I'm going to die. She meant dead now, like she was a talking corpse.
How do you, how do,
You know. Stupid question. His face ticked and trembled in the helmet.
that's crazy, eh?
Define crazy. The gang floated quietly, cheek to jowl behind Spindle in the cramped enclosure. Cruncher had stopped obsessing about the leg as soon as we'd sealed up. Or maybe he'd simply been overridden. I thought I saw facets of Susan in the twitching of those thick, gloved fingers. Spindle's breath echoed second-hand over the length.
If Bates is dead, then so are we.
Maybe not. We wait out the spike, we get out of here. Besides, I added, she wasn't dead. She only said she was.
Fuck.
Spindle reached out and pressed his gloved palm against the skin of the tent. He felt back and forth along the fabric.
Someone did put out a transducer.
8 o'clock, I said. About a meter. Spindle's hand came to rest across the wall from the pod. My HUD flooded with second-hand numbers, vibrated down his arm, and relayed to our suits. Still 5 Tesla out there. Falling, though. The tent expanded around us as if breathing, shrank back in the next second as some transient low-pressure front moved past. When did your sight come back? I wondered.
Soon as we came inside.
Sooner. You saw the battery.
Fumbled it, he grunted. Not that I'm much less of a spaz even when I'm not blind, eh? Bates, you out there?
You reached for it. You almost caught it. That wasn't blind chance.
Not blind chance. Blind sight. Amanda, respond, please.
Blind sight?
Nothing wrong with the receptors, he said distractedly. Brain processes the image, but it can't access it. Brainstem takes over.
Your brainstem can see, but you can't?
Something like that. Shut up and let me. Amanda, can you hear me?
No. Not from anyone in the tent, that voice. It had shivered down Spindle's arm, barely audible with the rest of the data. From outside.
Major Mandy! Spindle exclaimed. You're alive!
No. A whisper like white noise.
Well, you're talking to us, so you sure as shit ain't dead.
No. Spindle and I exchanged looks.
What's the problem, Major?
Silence. The gang bumped gently against the wall behind us, all facets opaque.
Major Bates? Can you hear me?
No. It was a dead voice, sedated, trapped in a fishbowl, transmitted through limbs and lead at a 3-digit baud rate. But it was definitely Bates's voice.
Major, you've got to get in here, Spindle said. Can you come inside?
No.
Are you injured? Are you pinned by something?
No. Maybe not her voice, after all. Maybe just her vocal cords.
Look, Amanda, it's dangerous. It's too damn hot out there. Do you understand? You.
I'm not out here, said the voice.
Where are you?
Nowhere. I looked at Spindle. Spindle looked at me. Neither of us spoke. James did. At long last, and softly. And what are you, Amanda? No answer. Are you Rorschach? Here in the belly of the beast, it was so easy to believe. No. Then what? Nothing. The voice was flat and mechanical. I'm nothing.
You're saying you don't exist?
Spindle said slowly. Yes. The tent breathed around us. Then how can you speak? Susan asked the voice. If you don't exist, what are we talking to? Something else. A sigh, a breath of static. Not me.
Shit.
Spindle muttered. His surfaces brightened with resolve and sudden insight. He pulled his hand from the wall. My HUD thinned instantly.
Her brain's frying. We gotta get her inside.
He reached for the release. I put out my own hand. The spike!
Crested already, Commissar. We're past the worst of it.
Are you saying it's safe?
It's lethal. It's always lethal, and she's out there in it, and she could do some serious damage to herself in her
Something bumped the tent from the outside. Something grabbed the outer catch and pulled. Our shelter opened like an eye. Amanda Bates looked in at us through the exposed membrane. "I'm reading 3.8," she said. "That's tolerable, right?" Nobody moved. "Come on, people. Break's over."
Amen. Spindle stared. Are you okay?
"In here? Not likely, but we've got a job to do." "Do you exist?" I asked. "What kind of stupid question is that? Spindle, how's this field strength? Can we work in it?"
Uh,
He swallowed audibly.
maybe we should abort, Major. That spike was.
"According to my readings, the spike is pretty much over, and we've got less than 2 hours to finish setting up, run our ground truths, and get out of here. Can we do that without hallucinating?"
I don't think we'll shake the heebie-jeebies, Spindle admitted. But we shouldn't have to worry about extreme effects until another spike hits.
"Good."
Which could be any time.
"We weren't hallucinating," James said quietly. "We can discuss it later," Bates said. "Now." "There was a pattern there," James insisted. "In the fields. In my head. Rorschach was talking. Maybe not to us, but it was talking." "Good." Bates pushed herself back to let us pass. "Maybe now we can finally learn to talk back." "Maybe we can learn to listen," James said. We fled like frightened children with brave faces. We left a base camp behind. Jack, still miraculously functional in its vestibule, a tunnel into the haunted mansion. Forlorn, forlorn magnometers left to die in the faint hope they might not. Crude pyranometers and thermographs, antique radiation-proof devices that measured the world through the flex and stretch of metal tabs and etched their findings on rolls of plastic. Glow globes and diving bells and guide ropes strung to one another. We left it all behind and promised to return in 36 hours, if we lived so long. Inside each of us, infinitesimal lacerations were turning our cells to mush. Plasma membranes sprang countless leaks. Overwhelmed repair enzymes clung desperately to shredded genes and barely delayed the inevitable. Anxious to avoid the rush, patches of my intestinal lining began flaking away before the rest of the body had a chance to die. By the time we docked with Theseus, both Michelle and I were feeling nauseous. The rest of the gang, oddly, was not. I had no idea how that was possible. The others would be presenting the same symptoms within minutes. Without intervention, we would all be vomiting our guts out for the following 2 days. Then the body would pretend to recover. For perhaps a week we would feel no pain and have no future. We would walk and talk and move like any living thing, and perhaps convince ourselves that we were immortal after all. Then we would collapse into ourselves, rotted from the inside out. We would bleed from our eyes and mouths and assholes, and if any god was merciful, we would die before splitting open like rotten fruit. But, of course, Theseus, our redeemer, would save us from such a fate. We filed from the shuttle into a great balloon that Sarasti had erected to capture our personal effects. We shed our contaminated spacesuits and clothing and emerged naked into the spine. We passed single file through the drum, the flying dead in formation. Yucca Sarasti, discreetly distant on the turning floor, leapt up in our wake and disappeared aft to feed our radioactive cast-offs into the decompiler. Into the crypt. Our coffins lay open across the rear bulkhead. We sank gratefully and wordlessly into their embrace. Bates coughed blood as the lids came down. My bones hummed as the captain began to shut me off. I went to sleep a dead man. I had only theory and the assurances of fellow machinery that I would ever be born again. Keaton, come forth. I woke up, ravenous. Faint voices drifted forward from the drum. I floated in my pod for a few moments, eyes closed, savoring absences. No pain, no nausea, no terrifying subliminal sense of one's own body sloughing incrementally to mush. Weakness and hunger. Otherwise, I felt fine. I opened my eyes. Something like an arm, gray and glistening, far too attenuate to be human. No hand at its tip, too many joints, a limb broken in a dozen places. It extended from a body barely visible over the lip of the pod, a suggestion of dark bulk and other limbs in disjoint motion. It hovered motionless before me, as if startled in the midst of some shameful act. By the time I had breath enough to cry out, it had whipped back out of sight. I erupted from the pod, eyes everywhere. Now they saw nothing. An empty crypt, a naked note-taker. The mirrored bulkhead reflected vacant pods to either side. I called up consensus, all systems nominal. It didn't reflect, I remembered. The mirror didn't show it. I headed aft, heart still pounding. The drum opened around me, Spindle and the gang conversing in low tones below. Spindle glanced up and waved a trembling hand in greeting. "You need to check me out," I called. My voice wasn't nearly so steady as I'd hoped.
Admitting you have a problem is the first step, Spindle called back. Just don't expect miracles.
He turned back to the gang. James on top. They sat in a diagnostic couch staring at some test patterns shimmering on the rear bulkhead. I grabbed the tip of a stairway and pulled myself down. Coriolis pushed me sideways like a flag in the breeze. "I'm either hallucinating or there's something on board."
You're hallucinating.
"I'm serious."
So am I. Take a number. Wait your turn.
He was serious. Once I forced myself to calm down and read the signs, I could see he wasn't even surprised.
Guess you're pretty hungry after all that exhausting lying around, eh?
Spindle waved at the galley.
Eat something. Be with you in a few minutes.
I forced myself to work up my latest synopsis while I ate, but that only took half a mind. The other half still shivered in residual thrall to fight-flight. I tried to distract it by tapping the biomed feed. "It was real," James was saying. "We all saw it." No, couldn't have been. Spindle cleared his throat.
Try this one.
The feed showed what she saw, a small black triangle on a white background. In the next instant, it shattered into a dozen identical copies, and a dozen. The proliferating brood rotated around the center screen, geometric primitives ballroom dancing in precise formation, each sprouting smaller triangles from its tips, fractalizing, rotating, evolving into an infinite, intricate tilework. A sketchpad, I realized. An interactive eyewitness reconstruction without the verbiage. Susan's own pattern-matching wetware reacted to what she saw. No, there were more of them. No, the orientation's wrong. Yes, that's it, but bigger. And Spindle's machine picked those reactions right out of her head and amended the display in real time. It was a big step up from that half-assed workaround called language. The easily impressed might have even called it mind reading. It wasn't, though. It was all just feedback and correlation. It doesn't take a telepath to turn one set of patterns into another. Fortunately. "That's it! That's it!" Susan cried. The triangles had iterated out of existence. Now the display was full of interlocking asymmetrical pentagrams, a spiderweb of fish scales. "Don't tell us that's random noise," she said triumphantly.
No, Spindle said. It's a Kluver constant.
Uh,
It's a hallucination, Suze.
of course, but something planted it in our head, right? And
it was in your head all along. It was in your head the day you were born.
no.
It's an artifact of deep brain structure. Even congenitally blind people can see them sometimes.
None of us have ever seen them before. Ever.
I believe you, but there's no information there, eh? That wasn't Rorschach talking. It was just Interference, like everything else.
But it was so vivid. Not that flickering corner of your eye stuff we saw everywhere. This was solid. It was realer than real.
That's how you can tell it wasn't. Since you don't actually see it, there's no messy eyeball optics to limit resolution.
Oh, James said, and then softly, shit.
Yeah, sorry.
And then
Anytime you're ready.
I looked up. Spindle was waving me over. James rose from her chair, but it was Michelle who gave him a quick, disconsolate squeeze, and Sasha who grumbled past me on her way to their tent. By the time I reached him, Spindle had unfolded the couch into a half cot.
Lie down.
I did. I wasn't talking about back in Rorschach, you know. I meant here. I saw something right now, when I woke up,
Raise your left hand.
he said. Then
Just your left, eh?
I lowered my right, winced at the pinprick. That's a bit primitive. He eyed the blood-filled cuvette between his thumb and forefinger, a shivering ruby teardrop the size of a fingernail.
Wet sample's still the best for some things.
Aren't the pods supposed to do everything? Spindle nodded.
Call it a quality control test. Keep the ship on its toes.
He dropped the sample onto the nearest countertop. The teardrop flattened and burst. The surface drank my blood as if parched. Spindle smacked his lips.
Elevated cholinesterase inhibitors in the ret. Yum.
For all I knew, my blood results actually did taste good to the man. Spindle didn't just read results, he felt them. Smelled and saw and experienced each datum like drops of citrus on the tongue. The whole biomed subdrum was but a part of the Spindle prosthesis, an extended body with dozens of different sensory modes, forced to talk to a brain that knew only 5. No wonder he'd bonded with Michelle. He was almost synesthesiac himself.
You spend a bit longer in there than the rest of us, he remarked.
That significant? A jerking shrug.
Maybe your organs got a bit more cooked than ours. Maybe you just got a delicate constitution. Your pod would have caught anything imminent, so I figure,
What?
some cells in along your brain pan going into overdrive. More in your bladder and kidney.
Tumors?
What do you expect? Rorschach's no rejuve spa.
But the pod? Spindle grimaced, his idea of a reassuring smile.
Repairs 99.9% of the damage, sure. By the time you get to the last 0.1, you're into diminishing returns. These are small, Commissar. Chances are your own body'll take care of them. If not, we know where they live.
The ones in my brain. Could they be causing?
Not a chance.
He chewed on his lower lip for a moment.
Of course, cancer's not all that thing did to us.
What I saw, up in the crypt. It had these multi-jointed arms from a central mass. Big as a person, maybe. Spindle nodded.
Get used to it.
The others are seeing these things?
I doubt it. Everyone has a different take, like.
His twitching face conveyed, dare I say it,
Rorschach blots.
I was expecting hallucinations in the field, I admitted. But up here?
TMS effects, Spindle snapped his fingers. They're sticky, eh? Neurons get kicked into one state, take a while to come unstuck. You never got a tat? Well-adjusted boy like you?
Once or twice, I said. Maybe.
Same principle.
So I'm going to keep seeing this stuff.
Party line is they fade over time. Week or two, you're back to normal. But out here, with that thing? He shrugged. Too many variables. Not the least of which is, I assume we'll keep going back until Sarasti says otherwise.
But they're basically magnetic effects.
Probably. Although I'm not betting on anything where that fucker's concerned.
Could something else be causing them? I asked. Something on this ship?
Like what?
I don't know. Leakage in Theseus's magnetic shielding, maybe?
Not normally. Of course, we've all got little implanted networks in our heads, eh? And you've got a whole hemisphere of prosthetics up there. Who knows what kind of side effects those might let you in for? Why? Rorschach not a good enough reason for you?
I saw them before, I might have said. And then Spindle would say, "Oh, when? Where?" And maybe I'd reply, "When I was spying on your private life, and any chance of non-invasive observation would be flushed down to the atoms." It's probably nothing. I've just been jumpy lately. Thought I saw something weird in the spinal bundle back before we landed on Rorschach. Just for a second, and it disappeared as soon as I focused on it.
Multi-jointed arms with a central mass?
God, no. Just a flicker, really. It was probably just Amanda's rubber ball floating around up there.
Probably.
Spindle seemed almost amused.
Couldn't hurt to check for a leakage in the shielding, though, just in case. Not like we need something else making us see things, eh?
I shook my head at remembered nightmares. How are the others?
Gang's fine, if a bit disappointed. Haven't seen the Major.
He shrugged.
Maybe she's avoiding me.
It hit her pretty hard.
No worse than the rest of us, really. She might not even remember it.
How how could she possibly believe she didn't even exist? Spindle shook his head.
Didn't believe it. Knew it. For a fact.
But how?
Charge gauge on your car, right? Sometimes the contacts corrode. Readout freezes on empty, so you think it's empty. What else you supposed to think? Not like you can go in and count the electrons.
You're saying the brain's got some kind of existence gauge?
Brain's got all kinds of gauges. You can know you're blind even when you're not. You can know you can see even when you're blind. And yeah, you can know you don't exist even when you do. It's a long list, Commissar. Cotards, Antons, Damascus disease, just for starters.
He hadn't said blindsight. What was it like? I asked,
Like?
although he knew exactly what I meant. Did your arm move by itself when it reached for that battery?
Oh, nah. You're still in control. You get a feeling, is all. A sense of where to reach. One part of the brain playing charades with another, eh?
He gestured at the couch.
Get off. Seen enough of your ugly guts for now. And send up Bates if you can find where she's hiding. Probably back at Fab building a bigger army.
The misgivings glinted off him like sunlight. You have a problem with her, I said. He started to deny it, then remembered who he was talking to.
Not personally, just human node running mechanical infantry. Electronic reflexes slave to meat reflexes. You tell me where their weak spot is.
Down in Rorschach, I'd have to say all the links are pretty weak.
Not talking about Rorschach, Spindle said. We go there. What stops them from coming here?
Them.
Maybe they haven't arrived yet, he admitted. But when they do, I'm betting we'll be going up against something bigger than anaerobic microbes.
When I didn't answer, he continued, his voice lowered.
And anyway, Mission Control didn't know shit about Rorschach. They thought they were sending us someplace where drones could do all the heavy lifting. But they just hate not being in command, eh? Can't admit the grunts are smarter than the generals. So our defenses get compromised for political appearances. Not like that's any kind of news. And I'm no jarhead, but it strikes me as real bad strategy.
I remembered Amanda Bates midwifing the birth of her troops. I'm more of a safety precaution. Amanda, I began.
Like Mandy Fine. Nice mammal. But if we're cruising into a combat situation, I don't want my ass covered by some network held back by its weakest link.
If you're going to be surrounded by a swarm of killer robots, maybe.
Yeah, people keep saying that. Can't trust the machines. Luddites love to go on about computer malfunctions and how many accidental wars we might have prevented because a human had the final say. But the funny thing, Commissar, nobody talks about how many intentional wars got started for the same reason. You still writing those postcards for posterity?
I nodded and didn't wince inwardly. It was just Spindle.
Well, feel free to stick this conversation in your next one, for all the good it'll do.
Ugh, dry throat.
Sorry. Oy. I know my head's all stuffy.
Imagine you are a prisoner of war. You've got to admit you saw it coming. You've been crashing tech and seeding biosols for a solid 18 months. That's a good run by anyone's standards. Realist saboteurs do not, as a rule, enjoy long careers. Everyone gets caught eventually. It wasn't always thus. There was a day you might even have hoped for a peaceful retirement. But then they brought the vampires back from the Pleistocene, and the great grieving Ganga did that ever turn the balance of power upside down. Those fuckers are always 10 steps ahead. It only makes sense. After all, hunting people is what the bloodsuckers evolved to do. There's this line from an early Popdine textbook, really old, maybe even Twensen. It's something of a mantra. Maybe prayer would be a better word. Among those in your profession. Predators run for their dinner, it goes. Prey run for their lives. The moral is supposed to be that, on average, the hunted escape the hunters because they're more motivated. Maybe that was true when it all just came down to who ran faster. Doesn't seem to hold when the strategy involves tactical foresight and double reverse mindfucks, though. The vampires win every time. And now you're caught. And while it may have been vampires that set the trap, it was regular turncoat baseline humans who pulled the trigger. For 6 hours now, you've been geckoed to the wall of some unnamed, unlisted underground detention facility, watching as some of those self-same humans played games with your boyfriend and co-conspirator. These are not your average games. They involve pliers and glowing wires and body parts that were not designed to detach. You wish, by now, that your lover were dead, like the two others in your cell whose parts are scattered about the room. But they're not letting that happen. They're having too much fun. That's what it all comes down to. This is not an interrogation. There are less invasive ways to get more reliable answers. These are simply a few more sadistic thugs with authority, killing time and other things, and you can only cry and squeeze your eyes tight and whimper like an animal even though they haven't laid a hand on you yet. You can only wish they hadn't saved you for last, because you know what that means. But suddenly your tormentors stop in mid-game and cock their heads as if listening to some collective inner voice. Presumably, it tells them to take you off the wall, bring you into the next room, and sit you down at one of two gel-padded chairs on opposite sides of a smart desk, because this is what they do, far more gently than you'd expect, before retiring. You can also assume that whoever has given these instructions is both powerful and displeased, because all the arrogant sadistic cockiness has drained from their faces in the space of a heartbeat. You sit and wait. The table glows with soft, cryptic symbols that would be of no earthly interest to you even if you could understand them, even if they contained the very secret of the vampires themselves. Some small part of you wonders if this latest development might be cause for hope. The rest of you doesn't dare believe it. You hate yourself for caring about your own survival when chunks of your friends and allies are still warm on the other side of the wall. A stocky Amerind woman appears in the room with you, clad in nondescript military weave. Her hair is buzzed short, her throat veined with a faint mesh of sub-Q antennae. Your brain stem sees that she is 10 meters tall, even though some impertinent gelatinous overlay insists that she is of only average height. The name tag on her left breast says Bates. You see no sign of rank. Bates extracts a weapon from its sheath on her thigh. You flinch, but she does not point it at you. She sets it on the desk, easily within your reach, and sits across from you. A microwave pistol, fully charged, unlocked. On its lowest setting, it causes sunburn and nausea. On its highest, it flash boils brains in the skull. At any setting in between, it inflicts pain and injury in increments as fine as your imagination. Your imagination has been retooled for great sensitivity along such scales. You stare numbly at the gun, trying to figure the trick. Two of your friends are dead, Bates says, as though you haven't just watched them die. Irrecoverably so. Irrecoverably dead. Good one. We could reconstitute the bodies, but the brain damage. Bates clears her throat as if uncomfortable, as if embarrassed. It's a surprisingly human gesture for a monster. We're trying to save the other one. No promises. We need information, she says, cutting to the chase. Of course. What came before was psychology, softening up. Bates is the good cop. I've got nothing to tell you, you manage. It's 10% defiance, 90% deduction. They wouldn't have been able to catch you in the first place unless they already knew everything. Then we need an arrangement, Bates says. We need to come to some kind of accommodation. She has to be kidding. Your incredulity must be showing. Bates addresses it. I'm not completely unsympathetic. My gut doesn't much like the idea of swapping reality for simulation, and it doesn't buy that what is truth spin the body economics sells to get around it. Maybe there's reason to be scared. Not my problem, not my job. Just my opinion, and it could be wrong. But if we kill each other in the meantime, we don't find out either way. It's unproductive. You see the dismembered bodies of your friends. You see pieces on the floor, still a little bit alive, and this cunt has the nerve to talk about productivity? We didn't start it, you say. I don't know, and I don't care. Like I said, it's not my job. Bates jerks a thumb over her shoulder at a door in the wall behind her. The door she must have entered through. In there, she says, are the ones who killed your friends. They've been disarmed. When you go through that door, the room will go offline and remain unmonitored for a period of 60 seconds. Nobody besides yourself will ever hold you accountable for whatever happens in there during that time. It's a trick. It has to be. What do you have to lose? Bates wonders. We can already do anything we want to you. It's not like we need you to give us an excuse. Hesitantly, you take the gun. Bates doesn't stop you. She's right, you realize. You have absolutely nothing to lose. You stand and, suddenly fearless, point the weapon at her face. Why go in there? I can kill you right here. She shrugs. You could try. Waste of an opportunity, if you ask me. So I go in there and I come out in 60 seconds, and then what? Then we talk. We just think of it as a gesture of good faith, she says. Restitution, even. The door opens at your approach, closes in your wake. And there they are, all four of them, spread up across the wall like a chorus line of Christs on crosses. There's no gleam in those eyes now. There's only a bright animal terror and the reflection of turned tables. Two of the Christs stain their pants when you look them in the eye. What's left? Maybe 50 seconds? It's not a lot. You could have done so much more with just a little extra time. But it's enough, and you don't want to impose on the good graces of this Bates woman, because she may at last be someone you can deal with. Under other circumstances, Lieutenant Amanda Bates would have been court-martialed and executed within the month. No matter that the four who died had been guilty of multiple counts of rape, torture, and homicide. That's just what people did in wartime. It's what they'd always done. There was nothing polite about war, no honorable code beyond the chain of command and the circling of wagons. Deal with indiscretions if you must, punish the guilty if you have to, for appearance if nothing else. But for God's sake, close the doors first. Never give your enemy the satisfaction of seeing discord in the ranks. Show them nothing but unity and flinty-eyed resolve. There may be murderers and rapists in our midst, but by God, they're our murderers and rapists. You certainly don't give right of revenge to some terrorist twat with over 100 friendly scalps on her belt. Still, it was hard to argue with results. A negotiated ceasefire with the third largest realist franchise in the hemisphere. An immediate 46% decline in terrorist activities throughout the affected territories, the unconditional cancellation of several in-progress campaigns that could have seriously compromised three major catacombs and taken out the Duluth staging grounds entirely. All because Lieutenant Amanda Bates, feeling her way through her first field command, had gambled on empathy as a military strategy. It was collaborating with the enemy. It was treason. It was betrayal of the rank and file. Diplomats and politicians were supposed to do those things, not soldiers. Still, results. It was all there in the record. Initiative, creativity, a willingness to succeed by whatever means necessary and at whatever cost. Perhaps those inclinations needed to be punished, perhaps only tempered. The debate might have gone on forever if the story hadn't leaked. But it had, and suddenly the generals had a hero on their hands. Sometime during her court-martial, Bates's death sentence turned into a rehabilitation. The only question was whether it would take place in the stockade or officers' college. As it turned out, Leavenworth had both. It took her to its bosom and squeezed hard enough to virtually guarantee promotion, if it didn't kill her first. 3 years later, Major Bates was bound for the stars, where she was heard to say, "We're breaking and entering, Siri." Spindle was not the first to register doubts. Others had wondered whether her assignment owed as much to superior qualifications as it did to the resolution of inconvenient PR. I, of course, had no opinion one way or the other, but I could see how she might strike some as a double-edged sword. When the fate of the world hangs in the balance, you want to keep an eye on anyone whose career-defining moment involves consorting with the enemy. And I am going to have to call it at that. Thus, we have learned that Amanda Bates has history. She's a character who did things, interesting things. We also learn more about the general setting of the book. The talking about the catacombs, which are where the people whose brains have been uploaded into quote heaven unquote are the realists who are apparently militant. We've just learned, and not especially thrilled with the whole let's upload our brains while still living into the cloud, as it were. I think that is stuff that gets dealt with in a bit more detail in the sequel, Echopraxia, but I do not know. I do have that book on order now, so it should be in. It'll be in by the time we've finished reading this one out. Certainly, yeah. I mean, we're halfway done now at this point. We're at the halfway point. Let's see. I could even tell you how many pages. Yeah, probably safe bet is three more sessions. Very safe bet is 3 more sessions. Whoops. Yeah. And then we'll have that out of the way, and we'll go from there. I will probably not start up immediately reading Echopraxia. I will have to read it and vet it first and get an idea in a sense. Reading a book totally blind and just coming up with voices on the fly and stuff would be nigh on impossible. I can do it for a short story because it's a short story. It's self-contained. I don't have to worry about things. I can reuse voices. It's not an issue. But doing an entire book, I've got to have at least some basic modicum of planning. Admittedly, not much went into this. I've kind of been faking it, but I am remembering the characters and who they reminded me of, and I imitate them accordingly. Yeah, we've also gotten some insights into the nature of Blindsight, the title of the book, related to how the visual cortex, in programming terms, is very hacky. It is kind of bogus. What we see at any given time is it's an interpretation at best of what's actually there, um, which starts getting really ooby shooby, if you will. One of those, don't dwell on it too much. It, mm, Frightening possibilities exist, and oh, how they will be explored. Oh, yes, they will. Oh, the best is yet to come, ladies and gentlemen. The best is yet to come. This book is great. It is so much fun. Um, you also have heard some intimations about the bicameral mind. What is the name of that book? And I do actually recommend it. What is that? Let me Google. No, Wikipedia. Wikipedia. It is bicameral mind. No, not the 10th episode of Westworld. Yes, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, a book by Julian Jaynes, which deals with how the human brain and the way we process information changed. Better part of like as recently as 3,000 years ago. Back, in BC. Conveniently, basically, when we were coming up with all sorts of creation myths, um, and all this other stuff, that's when the human brain starts changing, and we have to suddenly start explaining the world. And it's got to do with that. Um, it's got to do with our brains talking to each other. So stuff like actual miracles and actual magic, like genuine article stuff happening without any physics or chemical cause, um, is because our brain is saying it's there. Whether it is or not is not so is another matter entirely. Whereas now we think differently. We're more analytical. We don't see magic the same way. Some of us do, I'm sure, but it's pretty cool. It's pretty interesting stuff. Again, a bit ooby shooby because it's like, wow, how much do we really know about what any of us are actually thinking? What we ourselves are actually thinking at any given time, or perceiving rather, not thinking. Seeing, oh hey, so someone sees a literal, god with wings growing out of their feet, and they're like, well, yeah, obviously, there's a that's fucking Hermes, that's hi Hermes, what's up? Actually seeing that, your brain is seeing that, whereas now we don't see stuff like that anymore. Well, maybe we do. How do we know how much, how do you know the person next to you is real and not just something your brain just made up? Um, Hard to be sure. Every bit of analytical information we have indicates that yes, indeed, they are there, and that is the running assumption you have to have. Otherwise, you start thinking, oh, everything's a you start you fall right into solipsism real quick if you're not careful, and that's a dangerous place to be. So that's enough of the pop psych. Well, not really pop psychology, but psychology and brain chemistry and philosophizing. Um, that'll be it for me today. Hopefully, people tuned in and are currently enjoying this read through of Peter Watts's Blindsight. I sure am. I think the book is fun and a worthwhile science fiction read for anyone. It is a bit violent. It is certainly horrifying. The events and hasn't even gotten started yet. Let's face it. Um, but yeah, hope people are digging that. I do have my Mecha Mondays stream coming on Monday. Um, More Metal Wolf Chaos, I think, will serve nicely. And then my Warframe Wednesday stream will be on Wednesday, the usual. And then next Saturday, more Blindsight. So yeah, tune in. Same time every week. Uh, 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. On all those dates. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. Have a great day. Hope you enjoy. Hope you keep tuning in. If you're not tuning in and listening to this after the fact, that's fine. Keep doing that. I want to share this stuff with the world. All right. Have a good one, folks.